A year and a half ago, I traveled to a small town in the interior of British Columbia called Lillooet to witness firsthand what a post-wildfire landscape looks like. 1 year prior to this, as the interior of British Columbia was setting temperature records during the 2021 heat dome, the McKay Creek wildfire erupted, burning all throughout the summer. An event made even more intense by climate change and a century of colonial fire suppression. As I got out of the truck and walked through the burned remains of the forest, each footstep I took sent poofs of ash into the air. Everything around me looked like a moonscape. It's here where I began to wonder what kind of plants are going to reestablish this barren landscape, where that provides a habitat for ungulate grazers, birds, and fish. Although it's not just a habitat, it's the traditional territory of the St'át'imc Nation, who rely upon it for food, social, and ceremonial practices. The aftermath of this wildfire poses critical questions about the growth trajectory of native and invasive plant species, and how they respond to differing burn severities. The burning question: do these invaders seize the opportunity of the scorched, barren landscape to move in and alter the very roots of our ecosystem? In my research project, I set up 80 vegetation monitoring plots across differing burn severities. And I monitored what vegetation was coming back 2 years post-wildfire. My preliminary findings paint a worrisome picture. High burn severity leads to barren swaths of land ripe for invasion of plants, or areas that are already dominated by a single invasive species, pushing out the critically important native species that provide for the ungulate grazers and also food security for the St'át'imc Nation. My research seeks to refocus restoration, moving away from the generalized approaches of the past, such as mass seeding campaigns of dropping seeds from helicopters or only planting of economic and commercially viable tree species, and instead focusing and prioritizing based off of burn severity, invasive species presence, and indigenous food systems and food sovereignty. In a time of climate uncertainty, where wildfires are becoming more frequent and more furious, my research is not just academic. It's a blueprint for action. It safeguards indigenous food securities, prioritizes indigenous food sovereignty, protects wildlife, and reduces future wildfire risk so that a map that looks like this never happens again.
Imagine walking through a dense and vibrant forest surrounded by a variety of different tree species. How do we as individuals learn to differentiate between these different tree species that are in our landscape? Do we look at the shapes of the leaves? Do we look at the texture of the bark? Or do we look at the patterns in the branches that catch our eye? Now imagine a machine going on this exact same journey. How would they go about doing this task? In my presentation, Tree Species Estimation Using Deep Learning, we're going to go on a journey together as we dive into how machines learn and understand the forests that are around us. Join me and my friend Leafy Logic up here as we go on an adventure to explore how machines learn to understand the world around us and to estimate these tree species. Trees are a very important aspect to the forests around us, and they provide many different levels of economic value, different biodiversity. They're important for biodiversity, and they hold a strong cultural significance for many different practices. Unfortunately, mapping these species across large areas is a very difficult and costly task, and the estimates are often very inaccurate. Airborne laser scanning data, or ALS for short, is a 3D representation of the physical features on the Earth's surface. This representation is made up, it's called a point cloud, and is made up of many different points within 3D space that is able to capture the unique structural characteristics of these different tree species. Leafy Logic here is a deep learning computer that has the unique capabilities to estimate tree species from point cloud data, due to their abilities to make complex algorithms and to detect these different patterns that are within the data set. Leafy here is also really capable to understand the different patterns that go on within the structures of these trees and is able to estimate the species that are associated to that. Now, the question might be is how would we go about training Leafy here to go and estimate these tree species from a point cloud? Well, We provide them with thousands upon thousands of samples of point clouds of different tree species for them to be able to make these different connections to. Once they have learned everything there is to know about these different samples, they are then able to detect these different patterns that are unique to these different species in order to estimate them across the landscape. Once they have done this, they are able to then test what is going on, or we're able to test them according to the capabilities that they have learned throughout this approach. Fortunately for Philippe here, he was able to pass his test at the top of his class. Thank you.
What if I told you the mountain pine beetle, an insect the size of a grain of rice, impacted 18 million hectares in British Columbia? Or if I told you that over the last 30 years, we've seen nearly double the amount of large fires in the West. Non-stand replacing disturbances are events that result in incomplete removal of trees, or what I like to refer to as the little things that build up, generally occur at variable spatial intensities or over a longer period of time. Unfortunately, the way we look at forests in Canada, forest inventories, don't provide the resolution and detail on stand characteristics and are not conducted often enough for us to properly assess the impact of NSRs. With enhancement of things like Lidar, we can have better detail on stand characteristics, but we still don't have the time period to properly see how these NSRs evolve over time. With the development of open source satellite imagery, which is where my research comes into play, we're able to download really dense time series so we can see how the forests evolve using algorithms that also include like the seasonality, as you can see over on my left. The algorithm basically looks at once a image diverges from what its predicted trend, and can detect the change on the scale of weeks rather than years, which with traditional forest inventories have been doing. With this new development, we're able to see changes much quicker and be able to make decisions rather than years and on the scale of weeks, which provides new opportunities for us to see NSRs and hopefully make decisions that can prevent the next 18 million hectare mountain pine beetle outbreak. Thanks for your time.
Imagine waking up late on a Saturday morning to the smell of burning waffles and sweet maple syrup. It's a core part of many of our childhoods. But imagine if that sweet scent, that part of our identity, slowly faded away. Sugar maple, Acer saccharum, the tree responsible for the majority of maple products across North America, has been undergoing steady decline since the 1980s. If we don't act fast, childhood breakfast may never be the same again. Thankfully, sustainable management methodologies have been developed and have been applied since the 1990s. Unfortunately, these methods require information that is expensive and slow to obtain. Currently, we have forest health professionals walking the forest stands, looking for subtle signs of distress from the ground. Not only is this inefficient, and not only can we not gain a lot of attributes that we would otherwise gain from within the canopy, but it's also expensive to train. It takes many years to train new professionals, and many of the current professionals are reaching an age where it's no longer safe for them to venture out into these stands. That's why I'm developing a new methodology called Intra-Canopy drone photogrammetry. Now that is a mouthful, and I do have difficulties saying it myself. But what it really boils down to is flying small drones, not much larger than the size of a football or my head, around 100 kilometers an hour around a tree. Now, it might be looking a bit into the future. Currently, I can't get it past about 5 kilometers an hour, but the point still stands. We're able to gain imagery from within the tree canopy that we otherwise cannot gain from the ground. From this video, we're able to generate large and very detailed 3D digital models. These models are a treasure trove of information. We can apply empirical methods, so those that are similar to what we're currently doing from the ground. We can look for subtle changes in color, subtle changes on the bark. We can look for fungal growths, and we can look for larger things such as canopy dieback. But we can also apply novel methods, such as those developed by Brent and others. We can use machine learning, and we can apply other novel technologies that are now becoming more readily available. It's through my research that I hope that children will not have to eat burnt waffles without maple syrup. However, my research goes beyond the maple syrup. It's about protecting an industry that is vital to the Canadian economy. Thank you.
How much carbon is in the forest? This question is of global importance as we implement carbon credit systems that help reduce deforestation and sequester carbon stored in the atmosphere. When Taylor Swift is finishing up her Eras tour and trying to account for the large carbon footprint, she'd like to buy some carbon credits, protect some forest. But she needs to hire a carbon project manager who can accurately quantify the amount of carbon in the forest so that Taylor's money is being well spent, which is what we want. When that project manager goes to do this, the most reliable approach they have at their disposal is the use of light detection and ranging, or LiDAR data. LiDAR data is collected by flying a plane or a drone over the forest, which emits a laser pulse that measures the height. This creates a data product called a point cloud, which is shown in the middle of the slide there, which represents a very accurate description of three-dimensional and vertical forest structure. The conventional way we use point cloud data to estimate forest carbon is through the use of statistical summaries shown on the left side of the slide, such as mean height or the 95th height percentile. These are called LiDAR metrics, and they can be easily plugged in to different types of machine learning or statistical models to estimate forest carbon. But there's one really important problem with LiDAR metrics, and it's that they reduce this rich 3D representation of the forest to a collection of small statistical summaries that reduce the spatial context of this data. So how can we make use of LiDAR data directly without the need to condense it to these simplified LiDAR metrics? With the advent of deep learning and neural networks, we can now apply a neural network model directly to point cloud data to potentially derive more accurate forest carbon estimates. Our research hypothesizes that by applying a neural network to learn directly from point cloud data, we can provide more accurate carbon estimates than a model using LiDAR metrics. Neural networks learn by extracting complex nonlinear patterns directly from data. As we can see from things like ChatGPT, which extracts information from a 10,000-word text prompt, or the front iPhone camera, which can identify your face from 12 million pixels, neural networks can learn similar patterns in point cloud data to generate forest carbon predictions. I performed a study where I compared the forest carbon estimation of a neural network model to that of a LiDAR metric-based model. And we found that the neural network model reduced error by 22% compared to the LiDAR metric model. These results are promising and suggest that deep learning may be able to improve the accuracy of forest carbon models. While there have been 50 years of research investigating forest carbon modeling, many carbon projects still struggle to produce sufficiently accurate estimates that reach industry standards. So it's important that we continue to try and find new and innovative ways to answer the question, how much carbon is in the forest? Thank you.
Forest natural disturbances impact the forest in many different ways. They impact tree height, canopy cover, species recruitment, and so forth. Like we all saw very large wildfires occurring throughout Canada last year that burned millions of hectares of forests. However, there are other types of disturbances that affect the forest structure in particular in a more subtle and pervasive way. I'm referring to non-stand replacing disturbances, such as eastern spruce budworm that is occurring in eastern Canada, Quebec. So these disturbances that affect the forest structures are quite difficult to detect from traditional approaches. So imagine that you're walking inside a forest and you're trying to find signs of these defoliations, which sometimes are very very light or moderate. And so it's difficult to appreciate whether the tree is dying because of the foliation or if it's just a natural mortality due to other causes. So that's where remote sensing comes in. With technologies such as airborne laser scanning systems, or ALS for short, we're able to extract spatially explicit, fine-scale information about the forest structure, such as tree height and canopy cover, which gives us clues of where these disturbances are located on the ground and see how we can characterize them from a structural perspective. So the way the ALS works is it's an instrument that you mount on an airplane and you fly above the forest and it shoots a bunch of beams. And this instrument records the time that these beams take to hit the sensor back. And you can get a 3D reconstructions of the scene that you scan, such as the profile at the bottom of my slide. So that's where my research comes in. We're leveraging the use of ALS to extract the fine-scale information about the forest structure and relate that to the occurrence of spruce budworms, for example. So in particular, we're using cluster analysis to identify what these attributes are that help us identify these disturbances on the ground. And we found that three main properties of the forest are telling us that there's spruce budworm occurring over there. And that's tree height, canopy cover, and vertical height distribution. So what does this mean from a practical perspective? So we can now compare structures that led to a lower severity infestation with structures that led to a higher severity infestations. And then we can go to foresters and tell them, look, your forest, if you want to manage your forest, you have it more resistant or resilient against spruce budworm, you should mimic structures that we found that led to lower severity infestations, especially in an optic of exacerbating disturbance regimes due to preceding climate change. And so remember, next time that you're walking in the forest or you feel lazy, you don't even want to walk in the forest, want to check out what Pacific Spirit Park looks like, you can download the ALS data for Vancouver and see how the trees look like in a 3D space. I promise it's fun. Thanks.
Picture yourself walking through a forest carpeted with moss and dotted only with large hemlock trees. The canopy formed by the tall trees keeps it cool and dark, and it's open and easy to walk through. Now imagine you step out of that forest. The canopy is gone, so right away it's warmer and brighter and full of all different types of plants. Small trees like crab apples, shrubs like salmonberry, even flowers springing up from herbaceous root plants. It's hard to walk without running into a branch or tripping on a root. You may also notice that all of these plants are edible. That's because what I'm describing to you is what we now refer to in so-called British Columbia as an ancient indigenous forest garden. But these diverse gardens didn't just naturally spring into existence. They were historically managed by the people of these lands to be as productive as possible. Plants were watered, pruned, fertilized, even traded with other communities. Colonization abruptly put an end to this type of management, but the legacy of these historic stewardship practices can still be seen today, over 150 years later. Not only above ground in the diverse plant communities, but also below our feet in the soil. Both the soil chemistry, properties like nutrient levels and pH, and the soil biology, the types of microbes like bacteria and fungi, are known to hold this type of legacy. However, these gardens are now threatened by new colonizers, invasive weedy plant species which reduce food system productivity. This led me to question how these invasive plants might be changing the soils. Usually, invasive weeds are removed and the area is restored with native plant species, but these plants can't thrive given how much the new colonizers have changed the soil. This led me to wonder how invasive weeds might change the amount and type of soil microbes to the benefit of themselves and the detriment of native species. Soil microbes are extremely helpful for plants. They help them acquire more water and nutrients, resist against pathogens and stressors, and even regulate how fast they grow, which can all lead to more successful food production in the gardens. With this in mind, I traveled to the forest gardens to collect soil samples, and my results show clear differences in the microbial community composition of forest garden species, which are much more rich and diverse compared to both the periphery forest and the weeds. The elders of indigenous communities have told us that invasive weeds are changing the stories of soils, and now my findings confirm this. Knowing how crucially important plant microbe relationships are for things like regulating plant growth, we can now look at how they can be used as a management tool. By adding microbes to the soil through a process called inoculation, which is the next step of my project, we can look at which types of microbes can help native plants grow faster and suppress weed growth. These types of restoration approaches using soil microbes are not only key for the success of forest gardens, but are also an important step towards indigenous food system reclamation and reconciliation. Thank you.
What if I told you that an indigenous community in BC is fighting fire with fire and expecting to get revenues from selling carbon credits by doing it? Would you believe me? First, let's start with the problem, wildfires. We've seen that they are major problems in Canada from the record fire season last year. And these fires cost a lot of money to suppress. Last year in Canada, it was $5.9 billion from taxpayers' money. And this trend of increased severe wildfire season can be attributed to the current reactive approach to wildfire management and climate change. Talking about climate change, wildfires are a huge contributor. Some years emitting 2 to 3 times more carbon emissions than all other sectors combined. That's a lot. So what can we do about this? Should we fight all wildfires? Well, no, because we know we're going to lose that fight. But also, wildfires are natural and should be occurring. What we want to avoid, what we want to do, is to prevent these severe wildfire events by shifting from reactive to proactive wildfire management strategy. This is what Unisciteen, a First Nation in the Chilcotin in central BC, is doing by reviving an ancestral practice of doing cultural burning. They started their cultural burning program in 2018, and since then they burn yearly, lighting spot fires using traditional techniques. So these are low severity and controlled fires, and the goal is to reduce surface fuel and reduce the likelihood of severe wildfires in the summertime. They usually do this in the springtime when the fire risk is low. And so if we can understand and quantify this phenomenon, there may also be long-term carbon savings. And so you reduce the likelihood of severe wildfire event, and in turn you reduce long-term carbon emissions. That's amazing, but how can you scale this across the province? Well, for this you need money, and that's where the idea of carbon credits comes from, and that's where I come in. We are observing the effects of cultural burning on wildfire behavior and carbon emissions using a combination of ground measurements and remote sensing. Using this data, we drive models to predict wildfires of the future, where one future is with cultural burning and one future without. And then we compare carbon emissions from both. And if there are significant carbon emission reduction, then you can generate carbon credits. And that means a lot for Unisciteen, because that means that they can financially sustain their practice. So now if I ask you that same question again, would you believe me?
Today, I'm here to shed light on an issue that is impacting the forest of Western Canada for decades now. While large-scale wildfires are mainly, unfortunately, becoming part of our day-to-day life, another problem has been slipping kind of into the background. The mountain pine beetle effect, or other bark beetles, have been ravaging across Western North America for a couple decades now, leaving vast areas of forest that are dead and dying. Specifically here in BC, by 2015, over half of our lodgepole pines had been killed, and mountain pine beetle had spread into parts of Alberta. This spread into Alberta was of particular concern, as the mountain pine beetle had never previously been detected in Alberta. Cold winters had hemmed the species into the lower portions of BC. However, climate change and other factors, such as warmer winters and colonial forest practice, allowed the mountain pine beetle to spread north and spread eastwards, bringing it up and over the Rocky Mountains into the foothills of Western Alberta. The outbreaks that occur in both BC and Alberta are of particular concern, not due to their widespread damage, but the effects that they leave behind. These dead and dying forests pose a risk for forest fires due to the amount of fuel that can burn at an increased rate and a likelihood of a higher ignition. This is a problem. There's a lot of fuel models that are used across Canada and the world that can properly measure and predict the amount of fuels in a forest. However, none of these fuels can incorporate forest health, specifically mountain pine beetle attacks, into a forest.
That's where my research comes in. My research looks at helping improve characterizations and estimations of these mountain pine beetle attack forests, improving how we understand where the fuels are, how they change, and how they could potentially be moved around during death and damage of a forest. Specifically, my research uses light detection and ranging, also known as LiDAR, which, to put it simply, creates a 3D structure of the forest by simply firing a light pulse, measuring the time it comes back, and creating a fancy little 3D point cloud, which I can play with later. The measurements that are taken from these models can be used later to create models of the forest, predicting how much fuel is in different parts of the forest. For example, we can have better understanding how the canopy slowly starts to fade away and die as the foliage dries up and drops to the forest floor. And we can see increases in such as other surface fuels, such as coarse woody debris, fine woody debris, and shrub fuel loads as these trees slowly start to die, fall to the floor, increasing canopy gaps and promoting growth in the shrubs. This creates that kind of change in structure in fuels that I was talking about and creates that uncertainty that we need to better understand. Using the models derived from the LiDAR, I can create fuel maps as the one on the top of my slide here, which show canopy fuels. Fuel maps like this can be created by forest managers and other forest practitioners to gain a better understanding how their fuels are changing and be enhanced even further using the lower image from RGB or just simple red, green, blue image. This can characterize simple crowns into alive and dead and better understand our fuel management and forest health to a greater understanding as these impacts will impact us now and into the future. Thank you.
For decades, plastic waste has been accumulating in our oceans and lands, with annual estimate 48 million metric tons. Let's think about how often you buy drinks in bottles or food in plastic packages. Most of the packagings at the bottoms are all made from PET plastic, which is most commonly used plastic around the world. They are popular because they are cheap and convenient. However, it's crucial to know that a current report said over 70 million metric tons of PET plastic end up in landfill finally every year in the world. What's concerning, the PET can take at least 400 years to decompose. Furthermore, it's worth noting that the PET plastic are made from fossil resources. This reliance not only aggregates the dependence on limited resources, but also lead to environmental and social issues, like greenhouse gas emission and water pollution. Therefore, our project aims to reduce the reliance on fossil fuels by introducing biodegradable materials into PET. Luckily, we found our candidate. Hemp, a crop cultivated for centuries, can be matured for just 2 months. Furthermore, the researchers also found that the mechanical performance of hemp fibers can reach up to 800 micropascal, 10 times stronger than regular fibers, making it an ideal reinforcement material for composite. However, hemp and PET have totally different characteristics. Hemp contains over 68% cellulose, which absorbs water. But to make a plastic bottom, it needs totally reversed properties, hold and contain the water inside. That means that is also the current dilemma for all researchers. After great effort, we finally found a suitable chemical modification for hemp to make it more compatible with PET plastic. Meanwhile, we used 3D printing to create hemp PET plastic bottom and test their properties. The result shows that such bottom has better strength and decomposability compared to other biomaterial plastic. In summary, our project achieved multiple goals. It reduced the reliance on fossil fuels, decreased the environmental pollution, and paved the way for a new environmentally friendly material. Let's work together to make our world greener and cleaner for everyone. Thank you.
Did you know that forests, just like our humans, can suffer pandemics? Imagine a disease so powerful that it can destroy a whole species of trees. That disease exists. It's called Dutch elm disease, and it has already killed billions of elm trees around the world. Today, I want to tell you how my research might make us all forest doctors by making tools to identify Dutcham disease. It is a disease caused by an exotic invasive fungus that arrived in North America with imported elm logs about a century ago. The fungus is spread with the help of elm bark beetles, and it can kill trees by blocking their vascular system. Death comes quickly, usually just within a few seasons. So to detect the fungus early is important to prevent its spread. However, it is also a great challenge because the symptoms can be easily mislead. Diagnostic labs usually rely upon culturing the fungus, but it can take weeks and it is not always reliable. Luckily, the genomics revolution has made it possible for us to develop DNA tests, just like the ones that we used during the COVID pandemics to identify the pathogens. My research will try to develop a PCR test that can detect Dutcham disease from the infected tissues and also even with the vector beetles. To do this, I will need to find a unique DNA sequence within the Dutcham disease fungus genome and design a DNA probe that will be developed into a quick, easy-to-use detection tool that can be used on-site without a lab. With this technology, a forest health team can easily map and eradicate the Dutcham disease more efficiently, so then they can save more trees and prevent its spread rather than just signal the demise of the forest. I dream of a future where we can all be forest doctors and equipped with the tool to fight the hidden outbreak of the forest pandemics. Thank you.
Globally, boreal ecosystems sequester an estimated 9 billion tons of carbon every year. That's a lot. To put that into context, the global aviation industry emits about 1/9 of that every year. Canada is home to roughly 28% of this global ecosystem. So as a country, we play an important part of the global ecosystem that sequesters this amount of carbon. Now, in these ecosystems, carbon is sequestered through photosynthesis. So essentially, vegetation pulls carbon from the atmosphere, creates sugars, and emits oxygen. These sugars are then converted into biomass. Now the question is, how do we measure this flux between the atmosphere and vegetation? Traditionally, this is done through the use of aptly named flux towers, an image of which is shown on the screen here. So essentially, these towers are built across study sites across Canada, and they are equipped with instruments that can measure things like wind velocity, temperature, precipitation, etc. But most importantly for my work, they contain instruments that can measure this flux of carbon between the vegetation and the atmosphere. Now, a key limitation of using these data sets is that these towers are expensive to both build, maintain, and operate. So typically, you will find sparse networks of these across large areas, and studies at a particular site may only run for a few years. So as you can see on my map here, the pins represent these stations across Canada, and as you will see, many important ecological zones in Canada are not actually represented by these stations. So how do we overcome this limitation? Traditionally, using remote sensing data sets like land surface temperature and greenness indicators, we can create basic models based on the relationship between these variables and carbon sequestration that we can then predict over large areas. Now, the key issue with these methods is that they were developed for more temperate regions and do not commonly accurately represent the underlying drivers of vegetation productivity in boreal environments. This is where my work comes in. With the advent of new technologies in remote sensing that can capture things like soil freeze-thaw state, root zone soil moisture, and modeling frameworks that can now accurately represent long histories of disturbances like fires, we can now incorporate data sets that are actually more suited for boreal drivers of vegetation productivity than previously available. Previous models show a lot of over and under prediction when we compare them to these flux sites, but my work has shown that by incorporating these new data sets, we are able to constrain these estimates, especially when it relates to seasonal over and underestimation across large areas like Canada. Thank you.
This past year, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food reported that political violence and armed conflict are the leading drivers of food insecurity and famine worldwide. This can be seen in the ongoing famine in Gaza or in the destruction and displacement of communities in Darfur in Sudan. In rural communities in particular, who are reliant on subsistence agriculture for their livelihoods, the abandonment or destruction of agricultural land can have a huge negative input on their food security. In my research here in the Faculty of Forestry, I am looking at monitoring the impact of armed conflict on agricultural land using imagery and data from satellites. In particular, my research looks at eastern Afghanistan and Tajikistan, a beautiful but ecologically sensitive region where communities' livelihoods are particularly dependent on subsistence agriculture. Tragically, Afghanistan has been in a near continuous state of armed conflict since the 1970s. As you can see in this image here, taken from the turret of a Soviet tank in the Panjshir Valley of Afghanistan, the threat of war has loomed over these communities for several decades. As you may remember, in 2021, the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan. This has made it very difficult due to information blackouts and threats on the ground to researchers and journalists to understand what is happening. This is where remote sensing and satellite imagery proves indispensable. While our eyes can see in the visible parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, satellites, or many satellites, can see in other parts, such as in the near infrared, where healthy vegetation is highly reflective. Using this information, we can go back into the imagery archive all the way to the 1980s and look at, for how example, the Soviet invasion at that time influenced agricultural vegetation. Using remote sensing tools, we can look at what types of crops have been grown where, before, during, and after armed conflict. And finally, my favorite part, we can look at declassified high-resolution spy imagery to understand where historical forests have grown and where conflict-driven deforestation has occurred. Already, our results from this research have started to show some of the patterns and indices that emerge in agricultural land that's been impacted by armed conflict. And it is our hope that despite the best efforts of hostile actors, our eyes in the sky can better monitor the impacts of armed conflict and lay the groundwork for restoration and development work with partners on the ground in the future. Thank you very much.